So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Chris Jackson, a seasoned political pollster and Senior Vice President of Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for our April Inside Track election webinar. We have lots of data, as always, to share with you. And like Ellen said, that this will be recorded, so you can certainly reference it later. We are also happy to make any of these slides available to anyone. Also, if you have any questions as I'm presenting this, please don't hesitate to go ahead and use the Q&A feature on the GoToMeeting app, and I will answer the questions towards the end. All right, so what's the agenda today? Well, we're going to start off, as always, looking at what Americans see as the main issue facing the country. Then we're actually going to go through a series of those issues: climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine-Russia war, the economy, and then finally end up on our latest data about the election, the 2022 midterm election, which is fast approaching. We actually have our first slate of big state primary elections coming up next month. A bunch of competitive primaries to sort of see which Democrat and Republicans will be carrying the torch into November. So lots of things really starting to happen in that election front. But first off, let's start off with the main issue facing the country. And as you're probably not surprised, the economy continues to be seen as sort of the more mentioned issue of all things. Healthcare and really sort of anything related to sort of the COVID pandemic has been sliding down the lists. Crime and corruption, the environment are sort of perennial now, but sort of second tier issues. And war and foreign conflicts, which is really sort of focusing on the war in Ukraine, after spiking up in late February, early March, has slid back down as a priority as people have really sort of turned back to focus on the economy. But the thing I really want to note, and the thing I sort of have mentioned to you before, is that the reality is only about a third of Americans are saying the economy, unemployment, or jobs is their top issue. That's certainly not nearly as dominant a issue as, say, the economy was back during the Great Recession, which I think illustrates how this is a very diffuse and a very noisy landscape where there isn't really a single issue dominating debate or a single issue uniting Americans or that all Americans are concerned about. And in that environment, we should expect a very noisy media news environment and potentially a very noisy political season where there's lots of sort of issues that sort of emerge at various moments about, maybe kind of frivolous stuff. Which, probably will sort of revert back to the economy at some point, but because the economy is not nearly as dominant, it's not going to be sort of the thing people are talking about in the same way as we did a few years ago. Here's that same set of data for our most recent time point from our Reuters Ipsos survey, broken out by partisanship. You can see that the parties are actually a little bit different in their issue priorities. The economy, of course, is sort of the number one most mentioned thing across the board, but you do definitely see some differences with Republicans much more focused on the economy, about a third of them, and then immigration, and then sort of everything else, versus Democrats who are much more sort of diffuse with the economy, the environment, crime, healthcare, foreign conflicts, all being sort of mentioned by double-digit numbers, which I think illustrates sort of Biden's challenge that Democrats want many things right now, so it's hard for him to sort of have a focus on delivering one of them. And then independents are kind of somewhere in between, as is relatively typical. So that's sort of the background, right? This is what America cares about right now. It's the economy and a bunch of other stuff, but that bunch of other stuff can take control of the agenda on any given day, even if it's not necessarily going to dominate the debate over weeks or months. So let's focus on one of those issues, climate change. Earth Day just happened. We have several pieces of new research on that. And first is this one from a survey we've been conducting going back about 5 years now, where we are asking Americans about their view of climate change. And we've sort of broken it out into sort of how the debate has sort of been happening about climate change recently, where climate change is real and mostly caused by human activity. Climate change is real, but mostly natural. climate change is not real, and then people who say don't know. And what we've seen is the climate change deniers have actually been relatively stable at a low level, 13, 11%. But we have seen a little bit of a swing from the numbers of people who think climate change is real and human-driven versus climate change is real and natural, with the human-driven aspect climbing about 5 points and the natural aspect falling by about 4 points. So that gap has gone from about 20 points to about 30 points. With America sort of moving towards the sort of view that climate change is real and human caused. Still a very strong partisan difference between the two positions, attitudes on the two positions. But this is sort of America moving sort of closer to the rest of the world, where the large majority says climate change is real and human driven. So, when you see people talking about how attitudes on climate change hasn't really changed over the last couple of decades, that's not totally true. We are actually still seeing movement or evolution on the topic. Likewise, Americans sort of focusing on climate change as an issue has climbed over time. It's still very much a second tier issue. It's not dominating the stage like the economy is, like in the example we have before you, but it is very much sort of stuck in that second tier issue, along with things like abortion or guns or any of these other sort of things that are oftentimes thought of as single issue voter topics, which is sort of a place where it can have a significant impact on sort of the broader policy landscape. 8% in our current Reuters Ipsos core political. It's gotten up to sort of low teens in recent past, suggesting sort of, again, how despite people talking about the views of climate change hasn't really shifted, it has. We have seen movement, maybe not fast movement, but we definitely have seen some movement, and very much partisan, of course, driven, with Democrats being much more likely to mention climate change as a top tier issue than either Republicans or independents. And then when we ask Americans what they sort of are willing to do about climate change, we find that Americans are actually somewhat laggards behind the rest of the world in their willingness to do a whole host of different things to sort of limit their own contributions to climate change. Americans are more likely to do things that sort of are honestly sort of relatively easy lifts. So avoid products with lots of packaging, avoid buying new goods and buying used goods, switching off lights, or investing in sort of home efficiency sort of stuff, but much less likely to change their transit-centered behavior. So walking, cycling, or using public transit instead of driving, not flying or replacing flights with ground transportation, and then not changing their diets, like eating less meat, eating fewer dairy products. The meat and dairy products, I think, are really characteristic of sort of how sort of central those are to sort of the American identity of, sort of your steak and potatoes kind of thing. So it's sort of harder to move that. But I think the walking, cycling, flying stuff is, potentially about America being a car culture, but it's also about the reality of America. It's a big place. It's a big country. Things are spread apart. Our city and development patterns have really emphasized over the last 100 years sort of these sort of sprawling suburbs and exurbs. So it's just not really possible for most Americans to use a bicycle or public transit, not unless they're willing to spend hours and hours sort of engaged in that transportation versus cars. So I don't think it's necessarily a character judgment on Americans there. But we do see, compared to the rest of the world, we are a little bit less likely across the board to engage in a lot of these climate change mitigation behaviors. And one of the things that's sort of interesting is if you look at the data, Democratic Americans are very much more aligned with the rest of the world, which I think reflects both their views of climate change, but also the fact that Democrats are more likely to live in sort of cities where things like transit is available, and Republicans are much, much less likely to do a lot of these behaviors, which is really the reason I think that you see Americans sort of pulled back behind, is again because of that sharp partisan division we have in American society. And then sort of looking at sort of one of the key sort of ways that climate change is actually affecting our lives, we've been asking Americans over the last couple of years if their experience with various types of severe weather has gotten sort of more or less frequent. And what we've basically seen is sort of a continuing sort of, though noisy, sort of trend line of people sort of having greater experience with sort of severe weather. So you can see wildfires, droughts, severe thunderstorms all sort of being experienced by just under half of Americans, and then blizzards by a smaller amount, of course. Some of this is seasonal, of course. We do the survey every spring, and it's sort of if you've had like a bad season for wildfires, a bad season for droughts, you see these numbers going up. But it does illustrate, I think, the extent to which Americans are feeling some of these impacts in their sort of day-to-day lives, and are sort of realizing that some of these severe weather things are sort of driving on them. Switching agenda topics, COVID-19, the pandemic. So Fauci actually came out earlier and said we're out of the pandemic phase of the pandemic. So I'm not sure what we call it now. We need a new nomenclature, I guess. But we are still seeing a pretty significant amount of COVID out in the country. Cases are tested positive cases are somewhere about 50,000 right now, and that's probably an undercount given how much testing has sort of collapsed over the last couple of months. But what we're seeing in our Axios Ipsos coronavirus tracker is that America is very much sort of getting out, re-emerging, sort of getting back out into the world. You can see our trend line since last January, so about a year and a half ago, which was during the first COVID wave, first COVID winter rather, the second or third wave, depending on how you count. And you can see that people leaving their homes has gone up to about a third in the last week, so 66, 65% going out to eat or visiting friends or family in the last week. And the number of Americans who report social distancing or wearing a mask has declined pretty significantly over the last couple of months, down to only about a third of Americans saying they're social distancing, from a little over half over the Omicron wave, and then 19% saying that they were wearing a mask at all times. Numbers probably dropped a little bit more since we fielded this in early April. Now, so you are really seeing Americans' behavior switching as they sort of move forward in the pandemic, as they get sort of, to this post-pandemic period that we're hopefully entering. And when we ask Americans sort of what their attitude is, what their sort of, their stance, what they think the policy should be like, we're seeing actually a lot of stability, even as the Omicron wave has sort of faded a little bit from memory. And what we see is that the plurality of Americans think that we should be sort of opening up, but still taking precautions, 46%. It's functionally unchanged from February, which was during sort of the last part of the Omicron wave. Just under a third think that there should be no restrictions, no mandates, no requirements. And then a smaller number, just about 20%, think that there should be sort of high level or even greater levels of sort of COVID protection. So you can sort of really see the center of gravity is sort of towards opening up, but the large majority of Americans do favor some sort of COVID precautions, some sort of COVID mitigation strategies. So it's not like the country's totally like given up, no rules, anything goes. People are actually in favor of some sort of considered actions to prevent the spread of coronavirus, but maybe not like very heavy-handed or hardcore sort of restrictions. And as sort of an example of sort of where the American psyche is at right now, when we ask them how they would describe the coronavirus pandemic, the large majority describe it as a problem but manageable, 73%. Only 9% describe it as a crisis, and 17% say that it's not a problem. So you can again see that the large majority of Americans are in this sort of middle place of, it's a thing, it's real, it's an issue, it's something that we have to deal with, but it's not necessarily a full-blown crisis that requires us to sort of stop our lives. But at the same time, when we ask them if cases were to climb, would you start wearing a mask again? We do see a large majority, 71%, saying that they're somewhat or very likely to mask up if cases go up. So again, it's that sort of, Americans want to get on with their lives. They want to sort of get back to, seeing their friends and family, going out to eat, enjoying sort of the world, but they're realistic and are willing to sort of protect themselves if needs be. And I think this is actually the piece that I find really interesting, is that when we ask Americans, and this was in April, what they actually think the trajectory of the pandemic is right now in their states, we actually saw that among all Americans, the majority think that both cases, hospitalization rates, and deaths were decreasing. Now, the truth was, when we asked this survey, hospitalization rates and deaths were still decreasing, but COVID cases were actually staying the same or even increasing in some areas. So Americans don't actually have a terribly keen understanding of what's actually happening in the pandemic in their area at any moment in time. And you can see that there's not really a huge difference by media source in those views, right? So it's not like Fox News viewers are like, the pandemic's over, everything's fine, and mainstream network news, ABC, CBS, et cetera, are like, oh no, you got to be careful. There's really no difference between the two news outlets, which I think, again, just illustrates the extent to which Americans aren't paying close tabs of the pandemic and probably don't realize that, cases right now are actually on the upswing. Cases are going up. Now, if you're in Washington, D.C., there was the gridiron dinner a few weeks ago that basically everybody in sort of political Washington went to, and half of them got sick. And then there's the correspondence dinner that's happening this week, which people are concerned that might also have happened. Fauci himself actually said he's not going to go after all. So, there's definitely still some COVID out there, but we are seeing a little bit of a mismatch between Americans' understanding of what's happening and what's actually happening. And that's how you sort of square that circle of people stopping their mask wearing, right? That they're not wearing masks, they're going out more, and saying that they're willing to wear masks if cases go up, is that they actually just don't realize what's happening in the pandemic. They're just not paying that close attention to follow the, blips up and down on a daily basis. The Ukraine and Russia war, we actually are just about to release a new wave of the research we've been doing with Reuters on this topic. And we're really finding that American attitudes towards the conflict are pretty stable. This is a number from late March. We have, like I said, we have new numbers that we're going to be releasing that are very much on this trend. They're not moving, so you can just sort of take this and project it forward to now. But just under a third of Americans think that the Ukraine situation is not our business. A majority, just under 2/3, say that it's worth it to pay more for fuel and gas because of sanctions against Russia to defend another country. So we are seeing the large majority of Americans still willing to pay some burden or bear some burden to support Ukraine and believing it is our job or our role to be involved in that conflict. Likewise, we still see large majorities of Americans supporting various efforts that mostly have been put in place to sort of affect what's happening in the conflict, including sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Russian oligarchs, providing weapons to Ukraine. And then again, we still see, and this is pretty stable over the last couple of months, very few Americans support sending U.S. troops or getting directly involved in the conflict, exposing the United States to sort of a direct, shooting war with Russia. There's very little support for that. So again, American attitudes towards this conflict are actually still pretty stable and have remained really stable over the last 2-3 months. And then this is, of course, the sort of the impact, and this is my segue to the next section. You do see that 3/4 of Americans say that we shouldn't be buying oil or gas from Russia. 2/3 blame Putin as the primary responsible party for this conflict, and just under 2/3 say that it's worth it to pay more for fuel and gas because of the sanctions on Russia. So, we do still see large majority support for these positions that are sort of helping or impacting inflation in the United States, which is my next topic, which I think is a little bit of the challenge we're in right now, especially for the Biden administration. So the economy, this is the main issue facing America right now. According to Americans, about a third of Americans saying that this is their top priority. And what's happening? Well, in our consumer confidence tracker, we see that American consumer confidence is kind of in this middling place. It's not great, it's not terrible. 53% when we fielded our last wave about a week and a half ago. 53 is about average actually for the historical time series, especially for sort of the period before the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. But it's definitely below where we were sort of in the immediate pre-pandemic period, where we were actually averaging closer to 64, 65 on our scale. And you can see actually there's been a little bit of a slide in consumer sentiment after the sort of brief vaccine summer we had last year, when consumer confidence was really hot, was really sort of climbing very quickly. It's been sort of ever so slowly sliding over the last couple of months, which I think is certainly a warning sign for the administration, for the Biden administration, but it's also a little bit of a warning sign for our country, as I think there is increasing sort of concerns that we may be entering a recessionary period. In fact, I think I just saw a story that came out earlier today that one bank is saying that we are very likely to be going into a brief recession in the near future. So this sort of slow sort of decline in consumer sentiment is, I think, a testament to just how uncomfortable people are right now. But it's interesting because it's not necessarily the same kind of decline in consumer sentiment we've seen in the past. And that's because of this sort of delinking of employment and cost of living concerns. So we can see that immediately after the pandemic started, consumer confidence in both their job security and their ability to make household purchases dropped down to where essentially only a third of Americans were confident in either. And that number climbed until we got to sort of the vax summer last year, where it sort of hit a real high point. And then since then, the job security number went down a little bit, but has stayed mostly stable, maybe down a touch, but has been pretty stable. But the ability to make household purchases number has continued to slide. And this is, I think, an illustration of the power of inflation and cost increases on the American consumer, and sort of what's happening in that delinking. Usually these things travel together. You can see they traveled together in 2020 during the pandemic. They're very closely aligned, but they're coming apart a little bit as we're entering this sort of inflationary period where people are actually pretty comfortable about their job security, pretty comfortable about sort of the employment picture, but not about sort of the cost of living. And that's the world we're in, right? It's not a pure, the economy's a mess and everyone's freaked out kind of situation. It's like, well, I've got a job, I'm sort of secure in that sense, but God, it's getting really hard to afford a lot of the things that I'm used to buying. Or even if it's not necessarily hard, like you see the prices at the gas pump and it's just like, that's a lot higher than it used to be. And I don't really love that. I could have saved that money and spent it on, something else, anything else, right? So that's sort of the world we're living in, is this delinking of the economic picture of the jobs, which tends to be very foundational, and the ability to afford your sort of cost of living, which is being really much impacted by inflation. And we can see that is really actually sort of affecting everybody to an extent. So this is that same number I just showed you, that comfort with making household purchases by sort of income bracket, household income bracket. And you can see people with households under 50,000 never really recovered much from the pandemic. There's a little bit of a bump last summer, but they've actually been pretty low and flat really for the past 2 years. So the inflationary pressures aren't really doing as much to their sentiment because they never really recovered a lot in the first place. But you're seeing it a lot more with people in sort of the middle tier, 50 to 100,000, and the upper tier over $100,000 of income. Those are the people who you've really started seeing a little bit more discomfort in that household purchase number, household comfort number rather, really sliding over the last couple of months as that inflationary pressure sort of kicked in. So that's where sort of that pinch is happening, at least in terms of change. Now, like the actual pinch, of course, is affecting people at the bottom. They just haven't had as much room to lose, basically, because they've been struggling all along. This is just some more data on people being worried about paying their bills and having enough money for groceries. And again, you can see that the highest level of worry is with those people at the bottom of the economic spectrum. But even among people at sort of the top end of the spectrum, there's a substantial number, between a third and a quarter, who are expressing that kind of concern. And what is this doing to how Americans are spending? Well, Americans actually, their spending patterns haven't changed dramatically yet, which is actually interesting. I was just talking to a market watch reporter about how some companies were actually seeing pretty robust performance and even like their high quality or higher end brands. And I think what you're seeing is a little bit of consumers being a little bit more selective about what they're buying, but not necessarily like going to cheaper brands or store brands or things like that. They really are, I think, just sort of looking for sales promotions, looking for those sort of ways to shave a few dollars off here or there, maybe buying just a little bit less, so getting the 8 count instead of the 12 count, and trying to stretch that out a little bit. But you really are seeing some interesting sort of mitigation behaviors at this point in time. And I think the real question is going to be, as inflation continues, which people sort of expect it to, at least for the medium term, how are these mitigation behaviors going to change? We'll keep tracking it, of course. And then when we ask Americans what their understanding of the economy is, it's pretty mixed, actually. And this, I think, goes back to the COVID numbers, is that Americans don't actually keep a really close track of what is happening with the economy on a day-to-day basis. So, when we ask Americans if the employment rate is lower now than it was a year ago, which is a true statement, only about half of Americans said that that was true. Likewise, when we ask if wages are increasing faster now than they had in any time in the last decade, which is also a true statement, only 40%. So you see Americans don't necessarily have a super keen understanding of what's happening in the economy, but they're very, very, very aware of the average price of food and gas going up compared to this time last year, 94% saying that that's true, which is actually true. So I think this illustrates how, even though the job picture is actually very good and the market has generally been pretty good this year, those aren't areas that Americans are in touch with. Prices, on the other hand, is an area Americans are very in touch with. And that's why I think you're seeing President Biden and the administration particularly getting pummeled by on the issue of the economy, is because that's the inflationary, the cost pressure, that's the piece that Americans are most close to, the one that they're most aware of. And even if there's these other good things happening, like jobs, like wages, they're just not as in touch with those issues, right? Which brings me to my last topic, which is the election. So I'm going to sort of do a little bit of a grab bag of things affecting the election as we sort of go through here, and they're not in any particular order here. But first off, the pandemic. Pandemic is, still a thing, and we asked Americans recently if they were going to be more or less likely to support a candidate who does various things around the pandemic. And one of the statements we asked was if they're more likely to support a candidate who's changed their position on COVID rules based on their understanding of current risks and conditions. And we see that a large majority, 2/3 of Americans, say that they're more likely to support a candidate who's changed their positions over time, which is sort of the only place we see really clear unanimity across parties. But I think it does illustrate that, you don't necessarily have to have always had the same positions. Americans are somewhat reasonable and understand that things have changed and our understanding has changed, and it's okay for a political leader's position to have changed as long as it's sort of been following our best understanding. But then beyond that, it's sort of all over the place. So Democrats are more likely to support candidates who support continued rules like mask requirements, 79% versus only 1/3 of Republicans. And then Republicans are more likely, about half of them say that they're more likely to support candidates who have talked about how elites are exaggerating the danger of the pandemic or has opposed COVID vaccine or mask requirements from the start of the pandemic. So you can see there's actually a little bit of a mismatch between some of these ideas, right? 54% saying Republicans saying they're going to more likely support someone who's opposed things from the start versus 66% who support someone who's changed their positions. There's some logical mismatches between that, but it really does, I think, illustrate the issue, and particularly for Democrats being sort of pro COVID mitigation is a very important thing, something that's very impactful, and being a real strong anti-mitigation thing is important for Republicans, but maybe not quite as important as some other issues, that 57 versus that 79. So I think it sort of shows how the pandemic is, I think, a little bit more of an issue for Democrats moving forward than being anti COVID mitigation is for Republicans. But this is sort of the how the pandemic will probably continue to affect politics going into the midterm election. The Supreme Court. So there is a recent appointment and confirmation of a new justice to the Supreme Court. Ketanji Brown Jackson, first Black woman on the court. Most Americans, not most, about half of Americans support her nomination to the court, and essentially 2-to-1 support to oppose. Another about quarter said that they don't know. Very strong partisan skews by the impact. Americans sort of thinking that it's important that there's 4 women on the court for the first time, or there's 2 African Americans on the court for the first time. But the one thing, and it's not on the slide, but the one thing that's, I think, important to note is that Americans are not expecting Justice Brown's confirmation to really change the court or change what it's going to do in the near term. So I don't necessarily think that this Supreme Court hearing is really going to be moving the needle going into this November. Now, if there's another vacancy, that may change the situation a little bit, but at least this particular seat, I don't think is really going to be moving the needle too much. This is data from our new WE barometer, and we may change the name because we don't totally love it. But essentially what we're doing is we're measuring social cohesion or division in America, and we're going to be measuring it on sort of a weekly basis. And we're going to do that in a way that's, I think, very sort of practical. We're asking people essentially, have you had a meal in the last month, last 6 months, last year, with people from various different sort of groups in society. So for instance, we asked white Americans if they'd had a meal in the last 6 months with Black, Hispanic, or Asian Americans. You can see only a little over a third, or 2 in 5 Americans, white Americans, said yes. We asked Black Americans the same question about white, Hispanic, or Asian. Hispanic Americans, the same question about white, Black, and Asian, and then Asian Americans, of course, about white, Black, and Hispanic. And you can see that particularly among white and Black Americans, there's not actually a lot of socializing across sort of those lines. Among Hispanic and Asian Americans, there's a majority say that they'd had a meal with a white American in the last year. And I think this is an example of some of that sort of social division we have, particularly between white and Black America, where there isn't necessarily quite as much social interaction. There's not as much sort of meeting. And some of this is probably exacerbated by the pandemic, which has made it harder to, eat out with people. But I think it does also illustrate how, particularly even Hispanic and Asian Americans, there's a little bit of an easier time crossing some of these boundaries than there is with white and Black America. And then we asked the same question to Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And what we found is that only about 2 in 5 Democrats said that they had, I got my colors reversed in this, didn't I? 2 1/3 Democrats said that they had recently, in the last 6 months, had a meal with a Republican. About half of Republicans that they said that they had had a meal with Democrats, and only about a third of independents said that they'd had a meal with either Republican or Democrat. Independents are more likely to say they didn't know who the partisanship of who they had a meal with. But again, I think this illustrates how partisanship is also sort of one of these cleavage lines in American society, and particularly for Democrats, there is, I think, increasingly a sort of isolation where you aren't socializing with Republicans quite so much. Some of that is geographical, right? So Democrats living in sort of cities, fewer Republicans around, versus Republicans who are more suburban, exurban. Maybe there's a little bit greater opportunity to sort of see Democrats. Also, maybe pandemic, Democrats are less likely to go out. But, when we talk about sort of society and sort of the partisanship or racial divisions in society, this is an example of those, of like how those sort of play out in real life. So we're going to be actually tracking this on a monthly basis going forward to sort of see if we're seeing any changes in this. This is actually from a fun survey we did a few weeks ago. We asked Americans what TV shows they thought were more realistic depictions of the world political TV shows were a more realistic depiction of how sort of real Washington works. And Americans sort of picked the sort of the dramas, right? The West Wing, Madam Secretary, The Good Wife, The Crown, which is, theoretically based on true story. Even things like sort of the more sort of tensey kind of ones like House of Cards or 24 Scandal. And Americans were least likely to say that the comedies like Parks and Rec or Veep were realistic. And as someone who's been in Washington for almost 20 years, I can tell you Veep is actually relatively realistic for how this town works. But it was just sort of an interesting poll we did about how people are conceiving of how Washington works, where they're sort of getting that information or that idea, that sort of, that vision of what the government works like. And then when we ask them directly, who provides a better portrayal of how government really works, Americans are kind of divided between saying cable news, political TV shows, and neither, which I think, again, sort of reflects how Americans sort of distrust or maybe disgust in government a little bit, but also how, the news does not necessarily have a monopoly on sort of affecting how Americans see how the country works. So let's get to the actual politics. So the economy is the number one issue Americans want Biden to prioritize, even though as an issue facing the country, it's not necessarily quite as dominant in terms of what people think Biden should be looking at. It's very clearly number one by a pretty substantial margin, 52%, more than half. The economy. And you've seen even sort of like jobs coming down. Again, this is sort of what I was talking about a minute ago, how jobs actually people are secure about. The economy, which I think in a lot of ways means inflation here. Bigger priority, immigration ticking up a little bit, COVID coming down a little bit, the rest of these, going up slightly, but basically moving around their normal sort of resting place. So heading into the midterm, the economy is the number one issue that Biden and Democrats need to be focusing on. And that's kind of a problem for them because Americans don't think that Biden is doing a terribly good job on the economy right now. This is from our ABC News polling. Over the last year and a month now, I guess, just since Biden was inaugurated. And we can see the number of Americans giving Biden good marks on the economy has dropped from 60% to 40%, which is about where his overall approval rating is. The number of Americans giving Biden good marks on inflation. We started asking this question last December, but it's been pretty bad, 28% to 29%, so that's not a good margin. Gas prices has actually improved slightly, 28 to 31%, but 31% is still a pretty bad mark. So you can see that even though Biden's actually getting a little bit more credit on the pandemic, his numbers on climate change or Russia are okay, not great, but okay. The fact is that he is not being seen very positively on the core issue, which is the economy, and particularly the part of the economy people are most concerned about, inflation and gas prices. And that's a bad sign for Democrats going into November, because we do sort of see across all the elections work Ipsos does around the world that the party or president who's strongest on what people think is the main issue tends to win. And the fact that Biden, who's the standard bearer for the Democratic Party, is so weak on this, it's a really problematic sign for Democrats. And then Biden's approval rating has been relatively stable since sort of the inflationary period kicked in last fall, around 42, 43%, maybe 40 to 45 total. These are pretty much on par with where Donald Trump's approval ratings were also through much of his administration, and are not necessarily good in any historical sense. These are relatively low, though certainly not terribly low, like George W. Bush's approval rating got to under 20% by the end of his administration. But this is, I think, again, sort of a warning sign for Democrats going into the midterm that their sort of brand is a little bit weaker because they're not dealing with some of these key economic concerns that people are worried about. So where are we? So this is our sort of projection. We think there's about a 1 in 10 chance that Democrats are able to hold on to things. That might be a little bit optimistic for them, honestly. We think there's a 5 in 10 or a 1 in 2, like a coin flip, that there'll be sort of narrow Republican victories, and that would be Republicans take control of the House by sort of small, medium margins, 10 to 20 seats. The Senate, which is a little bit of an outlier sometimes, it doesn't necessarily follow the House and the presidency quite so closely. It's a little bit more independent in the way it moves. Could go either way, could maybe stay 50-50 with the Democrats controlling because of Vice President Harris, or Republicans could take control of it by a seat or two. And then about a 4 in 10 chance of sort of a red wave. This is big pickups for Republicans in both the House and the Senate. 40-50 seat majority in the House, 4, 5, 6 seat majority in the Senate. This is sort of what we see as sort of the likely outcome. So, 90% that Republicans are going to be making gains, making sort of pickups. And I think it's really a question of, are those gains sort of moderate or large? And I think the real factor that's going to decide that is going to be what happens with the economy over the next 6 months. And does inflation sort of feel like it's getting under control? Do people feel a little bit more secure about their household ability to afford their household? Or does inflation continue at sort of a really high clip, in which case I think this would move a little bit towards the red wave side. So that's it. That's what we got today. So now for questions. Let's see what we got. Since perceptions are developed by watching media, it would be interesting to show more data by source of news, social, liberal, conservative. Yeah, totally. I think there's a lot of these data points that are interesting to look at by people's primary news source, and we do some of that. It's oftentimes, if you look at Fox News viewers versus MSNBC and CNN viewers, there's even bigger differences than if you look at Republicans versus Democrats. And it's interesting because like Fox News viewers, it's about half Republicans, but the other half are people who are Democratic or independent, more independent than Democrats, as you would imagine. But even knowing that, it's still a little bit more to the right of your Republicans. Likewise, CNN, MSNBC aren't just Democrats. There's a smattering of independents, Republicans in there, and are still a little bit to the left of your sort of average Democrat. I think is a good note. There actually was this really interesting piece of research that came out a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if anybody saw it, but these researchers paid a bunch of people who were Fox News watchers, people who sort of habitually watched like I think an hour or more of Fox News, paid them to watch CNN or MSNBC for like a month instead of watching Fox News, and asked them, did sort of a survey with them at the beginning, which measured sort of their position on a bunch of political issues, but also sort of their knowledge of various sort of factual-based things. And I think they did this in 2020. And then, recontacted them every week, asked them some knowledge questions to make sure they were in fact watching, CNN or MSNBC, whatever. And then sort of did another survey with them at the end of the period. And what they found is that the political issues of these individuals, these Fox News viewers who'd been watching a different network for the last month, had changed a little bit, had gotten a little bit more sort of softer, a little bit less sort of conservative, but their knowledge of what's happening out in the world had grown substantially compared to sort of that baseline number from seeing those other news sources. So there's a really pronounced difference based on sort of where people are getting their news from. And then the experiment ended, they stopped paying them to watch the other channel. Most of these people went back to watching Fox, which is their preference. And when they recontacted the same people about a month later, all of the numbers had shifted back to that initial standpoint, right? So it's interesting. And one of the conclusions was that it's not so much that people's attitudes about things are fixed, but that they are, because they're sort of under a continual stream of information, it's that continual stream of information that's fixing people's positions or attitudes more so than any sort of, belief that exists sort of in the isolation. And that news source, that channel you're getting your information from, has a huge impact on sort of what those understandings or beliefs are. It's a fascinating piece of research, really interesting. I definitely say you should check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. Let's see, what else? What other questions do we have? What impact is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter going to have on politics? That's a good question. We don't know yet. Of course, it's sort of not happened yet. I guess it's not really final. It's going to happen. I'm not totally sure. So we actually have some data. We did a survey a couple of weeks ago, and we actually just repeated it, where we've asked Americans about their awareness of the goings-ons with Twitter, and also about their views of Musk and his purchase and what its impact is. And opinions are pretty mixed, as you would guess, based on the conversation. But the plurality are sort of on the side that they think Musk is going to make Twitter a more sort of free platform, but also Musk is going to make it make conversation on the platform better. So it's not necessarily where everyone's like, oh God, this is terrible, it's the end of the world, even if maybe your Twitter feeds does say that. But that among Americans, and even among people who use Twitter every day, the plurality, not quite the majority, but more on not, are like sort of giving Musk a little bit of benefit of the doubt, thinking that he might be able to do something. So, I think it is, Americans, at least at this moment, are not necessarily thinking it's a run for the hills kind of situation. But we will see, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen. I think we'll have to see what Musk and the leaders of Twitter end up deciding to do there. Let's see. What can the Democrats do to get back on track for November? Honestly, I don't know if there's much the Democrats can do. I think it is kind of out of their hands, and it's about inflation fundamentally. It's about cost of living. It's about prices, and there's only so much that the government can do, I think, to affect that. But if inflation does come down, if you do see some of these cost of living increases sort of stabilize, that will certainly make it less bad for Democrats. I don't think we're in a place where it's going to move to being good for them. But, I think to some extent it's a little bit outside their control at this moment. And I think, there's all the sort of the crazy stuff happening in the news media, the book banning and critical race theory and, LGBTQ stuff that sort of dominates the media cycle for a day or two. And those things are certainly topics that are sort of adding to the churn, adding to the noise. But I think the thing that's really affecting most people is that economy, is that economic stuff. Those are all the questions I see right now. So unless anyone else has something they want to chime in here, I appreciate your time today, and hope you have a great week.
I just want to step in, and I really want to thank Chris for today's presentation. Always really interesting data and perspective. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If in the meantime you think of more questions, feel free to reach out to us directly. And of course, a link to the recording will be emailed out as well. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, and thanks again, Chris.
Thank you. Be good.